Our topic this evening is the book of Daniel, and we're going to look particularly at an aspect of the book of Daniel that I think is pretty obvious, which is what happens when prophecy fails. What happens if a prophet makes predictions about the future and then those predictions do not come to pass, or a different future unfolds instead of what was predicted. And one thing before we even get started, this is one of two different ideas that existed in ancient Israel and the ancient world in general about what prophecy is about. And so many people will think of prophets as making predictions about the future. And this certainly became true in the Second Temple period as the prophetic tradition was displaced by a new apocalyptic tradition, an apocalyptic tradition that was predicting an end of the world. Whereas the earlier prophetic tradition, I think, is more about a person who is speaking truth to power, who is calling on kings or judges and telling them if we don't change course here as a people, we're going to have very bad consequences. But in particular, an apocalypse like Daniel is making predictions about the future, and some of these don't take place. So that picture that we had from the image there of the writing on the wall, it reminded me of, you walk around the city of Toronto like I do, there is a very frequent graffiti tag where it says Daniel 5:5. And this is ubiquitous. Anywhere you go in the city of Toronto, it's maybe just this one guy's running around doing this on absolutely every building. But anyway, if you read, that's actually a Bible verse. And if you read that verse in Daniel 5:5, it says, "Immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and began writing on the plaster of the wall of the royal palace next to the lampstand. The king was watching the hand as it wrote." So that's the reference that the graffiti artist is making. Toronto's literarily minded graffiti artist is not alone in referencing this vision. It's a vision of King Belshazzar of Babylon in chapter 5 of the book of Daniel. And it's given birth to a popular English idiom or expression. I can read the writing on the wall, which in addition to just being something that people say, is referenced in a number of pop song lyrics, including Paul Simon's Kodachrome. So I can read the writing on the wall. So where does this come from? According to chapter 5 in the book of Daniel, King Belshazzar of Babylon was the son and successor of King Nebuchadnezzar, a little more famous king. King Belshazzar had the sacred vessels from the destroyed Jerusalem temple. So the Babylonians had destroyed Jerusalem and its temple and brought the plunders with them to Babylon, along with exiles, along with taking the nobles and priests and so on. And so Belshazzar has those vessels brought before him during this phenomenal drinking party where there are 1,000 lords in Babylon at the party. And so that's where we get this verse. "Immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and began writing on the plaster of the wall of the royal palace next to the lampstand. The king was watching the hand as it wrote. The king's face turned pale, and his thoughts terrified him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king cried aloud to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, the diviners, and the king said to the wise men of Babylon, 'Whoever can read this writing and tell me its interpretation shall be clothed in purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall rank third in the kingdom.'" So despite all of these incredible rewards for being able to figure out and interpret what the writing means, none of the wise men are able to even read or much less interpret the writing. But the queen remembers that there is, quote, a man in your kingdom, Belshazzar, endowed with a spirit of the holy gods. And so she tells the story of how Daniel had been interpreting visions in his father's era. And so Daniel is brought to the court, and he says he doesn't want any of those rewards, and he spends some time rebuking the king and the court for profaning these vessels from the Jerusalem temple. But then Daniel gets to the point. He can read what has been written on the wall, and he can interpret the writing. And so this is the writing that it was inscribed, we read in verse 25. Mene tekel parsin. And then Daniel has the interpretation. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene. That means God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. And Paris. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So this is a prophecy of doom, a prediction of doom for Belshazzar and his kingdom. And so the book of Daniel then assures us that that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, as the Bible calls the Babylonians, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom. And so this is a map now of, you can see the Babylonian Empire, what we call the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and its much larger neighbor, the Median Empire, which is the empire of the Medes, who were the precursor state to the Persian Empire. So the book of Daniel thus sets up its protagonist as a prophet with amazing predictive abilities. He interprets a prediction which is fulfilled that very night. There's only a few problems with this particular episode. So one, the Medes never conquered Babylon. So it's not that they conquered it there right after the prediction. They never did. In fact, it's Cyrus of Persia that conquered Babylon. Two, there never was a Darius the Mede. So Darius is not even a Median name. Darius is a Persian name, and there's a later famous King Darius of Persia. And finally, three, Belshazzar was not actually the son of Nebuchadnezzar I. He's possibly a great-great-grandson, but he's the last king of the Babylonian Empire, but not by the relation that the book of Daniel gives. So how could Daniel get history so wrong? So prior to the Babylonians' overthrow by Cyrus of Persia, the Medes had been a great Middle Eastern power. We saw their big empire on the map a couple slides ago. The fact that Cyrus and not the Medes had conquered Babylon, that was a very well-known historical event. And certainly it would have been something known to the exiles who were in Babylon, exiles like Daniel, and certainly many other texts of the Bible credit Cyrus for letting the exiled Judeans who had been living in Babylon, Cyrus lets them go home to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. So how is it that the book of Daniel gets this, extremely well-known event so wrong, ascribing it to the Medes? One possible answer, of course, is anachronism. So one of the things that we see when we have a text that is written much later than it's pretending to be written, the writers in later times are not actually anywhere near as aware of history as we are. And so, because we can look these things up and they hadn't developed the modern academic disciplines of history, they had less access to historical records and much less the ability to reconstruct history the way we can now. And so that's possible, for sure. Even so, in this case, I'd say the error is so glaring that the author may have actually been attempting to do something else. He may be trying to fix history so that it conforms to past prophecies that failed to occur. In other words, the author knows maybe that the Persians are the ones that conquered Babylon, but he would rather mix that up or muddy the waters a little bit and say, well, it's actually the Medes and the Persians, or maybe it was a king of the Medes, maybe Darius, if there was a Darius, king of the Medes, which there wasn't. Maybe something like that is what happened. And this may be because of earlier prophecies that were important to this author. So it turns out that both the books of Jeremiah, in chapter 51 of Jeremiah, and also of Isaiah, in chapter 13 of Isaiah, those earlier prophets predicted that Babylon would be used by God, would be an instrument, that the Medes would be an instrument of God who would attack and destroy Babylon. And it's a possibility of something that might have happened. We saw on the map the Medes were an important and impressive power. Certainly they were a threat to Babylon's independence, but the Medes and the Babylonians had actually worked in harmony together and had been allies. They together had destroyed the Assyrians. And so anyway, this prediction that Isaiah and Jeremiah had did not actually happen. So it didn't happen in real history. It does happen, though, in Daniel's fictive history. So maybe this is a deliberate attempt to try to make prophecies that failed not fail. So, the fictional court of Darius the Mede at Babylon is the setting for the very famous story of Daniel and the lion's den. So this is one of many famous stories in the book of Daniel, and it's still remembered, alongside a similar episode where three of Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fellow Judean exiles, are cast into the fiery furnace. So there's a bunch of famous things that come from the book of Daniel. Another thing that's familiar to many anyway are some of these famous visions. Specifically, this vision of the statue, I think, is well known. So Daniel, one of the kings, Nebuchadnezzar, has a vision of a great statue whose head is gold, whose chest is silver, whose thighs are bronze, legs are iron, and feet are of iron mixed with clay. And then the statue is toppled by a rock that is cut without hands, that then expands to be a great mountain that fills the earth. And there's another famous vision of 4 terrible beasts that emerge from the sea. And there are a few other well-known episodes like Susanna and the Elders. And I think this one's famous because it is a subject of classical art. It's a biblical story where Susanna is being viewed by these elders as she bathes, and so therefore it's even though it's a biblical subject, artists were able to do nudity, and certainly it's a subject of the idea of male gaze, and so almost every classical painter, there's dozens of them who have done the same subject. Another episode, the Idol Bel, have Daniel sort of acting like an ancient true crime detective. So in the case of Susanna and the elders, Daniel is able to determine that the elders are lying by separating them and interrogating each of them and finding out that their stories don't match. So then he realizes that they are lying about their accusations, false accusations about Susanna. And he's also able to determine that the god Bel's idol, does not actually have the capacity to move because he finds clues of footprints of the priests in the sanctuary. We'll look at it a little more closely. But in any event, it's a fun story. So there's a bunch of things that are going on in the book of Daniel that maybe separate it from some of the other biblical books because it's more interesting. Finally, in terms of influence, perhaps the most important foundation that occurs in Daniel comes in chapter 7, where there's a vision in which the prophet sees, "I saw one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. To him, to the Son of Man, was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingdom is one that shall never be destroyed. And so this is one of the most explicit visions of a coming Messiah, a Messianic vision in the Hebrew Bible. And so as you can imagine, it's an important source for Christians who interpret the text as a prediction of Jesus. And the Christian Gospels in the New Testament, beginning with Mark, our earliest narrative gospel, actually repeat this vision of one like a Son of Man coming in glory in the clouds, which they equate, Mark specifically equates it with the prediction of a second coming of Christ in a very literal way, coming in glory. So the idea of an apocalypse that is preceded by the second coming of Christ in glory in the clouds. In the Gospels, Jesus frequently refers to himself as the Son of Man. And that reference, so man here is the same in Hebrew as Adam, so the son of Adam, but it may just mean human being. So it could be just a way of saying the human one, the human being will do this or that. Nevertheless, a lot of people, a lot of scholars, but also people who are wanting to emphasize the apocalyptic, think that that itself is a reference that Jesus is making, that he's equating himself with the Son of Man in the Daniel prophecy. So I would argue that that's maybe not the case, but it's certainly a reading that exists, or an understanding that exists once the evangelists are writing the stories down. Certainly that's what Mark and his successors believe, Mark and Matthew and Luke. So let's take a look now, having just surveyed some of its exciting contents, let's take an overview of the book of Daniel. Before we get there, who was Daniel? We don't have very many references to Daniel outside of the book of Daniel. If we look at the name itself, we can see that this is a theophoric name, so it has the word El as a suffix. So El is the generic word for God. And so Dan is judge, God is my judge, is what Daniel means. And there are some Daniels mentioned in the Bible. So Chronicles mentions that one of King David's sons is named Daniel. So obviously that can't be this Daniel, because it would be many hundreds of years earlier if it had been a real figure. And then the book of Ezra mentions that there's a priest named Daniel who returned with Ezra to Jerusalem after the Babylonian exiles were allowed to leave by the Persians. But this also can't correspond to the character in the book of Daniel, because we'd just be way too old by the time he would be a contemporary of Ezra. So it's neither of those two. Those are different Daniels, probably. But the prophet Ezekiel, who was active at the beginning of the Babylonian captivity, which is when the book of Daniel, the beginning of the book of Daniel is set, gives three references to a certain Daniel whom Ezekiel clearly regards very high. So in Ezekiel 14, Ezekiel says concerning this famine that the Lord is about to send, even if Noah, Daniel, and Job, these three were in this famine, they would save only their own lives by their righteousness. And he circles around and he repeats those same kind of comparisons at the end of his kind of extreme statements. So there's this famine is going to be really terrible. And Noah, of course, is famous for surviving a deluge. Job is famous for persevering in the face of great hardships. And so Daniel must be an important figure as far as Ezekiel is concerned to be able to weather something like this that is about to take place. So he's putting him in august company anyway. And in a rebuke of the king of Tyre in a later chapter, Ezekiel does admit that the king is extremely wise. He says, you are a smart, very smart fellow. Indeed, you're even wiser than Daniel. So again, this Daniel that Ezekiel knows has a reputation for wisdom. Ezekiel was himself an apocalyptic prophet, one of the first ones, because the earlier prophets are part of that previous tradition that I was talking about, where prophets are more concerned with telling people to change their ways, or they will face a bad end. And so Ezekiel uses visions to predict kind of a future end of this flawed world and a restoration of the paradisaic world, akin to kind of a new spiritual Eden. So he has a vision of a new Jerusalem, a new temple, and so on. That is very heavenly and cosmic. So during the Second Temple period, so following the time of Ezekiel, which is during the exile, the apocalyptic became increasingly popular, and indeed it displaced the older prophetic tradition. And so now new anonymous prophets, people who aren't writing in their own name the way Ezekiel did, decided to write in the name of legendary figures, or really pretending to be legendary figures, people like Enoch, who is a name that comes from the book of Genesis in the antediluvian period. So there are multiple books of Enoch, as we've seen, or Abraham. There are apocalypses of Abraham and all of the other patriarchs, Moses and so forth. So they wrote as if these were additional revelations given to Moses or Enoch in order to give legitimacy to their own texts. And so the fact that Ezekiel has mentioned this otherwise unknown Daniel, a legendary figure who Ezekiel feels is known for his wisdom, that made him sort of the ideal figure for a pseudepigraphic text. So I'm going to suggest, and we'll see, that apocalyptic writers in the Second Temple period are creating this book of Daniel, and they're doing it and assigning the name Daniel to it, in part the same way the authors of the book of Enoch did the same thing. So let's ground ourselves in the chronology here. So this is more or less the few hundreds of years that are leading from the destruction of the first temple and the removal of the elite from Judea to Babylon. So that is called out there as the Babylonian captivity. And you can see within that framework when the prophet Ezekiel was probably active, and then also the time frame of the setting of the book of Daniel. So in that captivity period, I added on here Cyrus conquering the Medes, since it's the Persians who first conquer the Medes and then conquer the Babylonians, not the other way around, the way we read it in the book of Daniel. And then the proclamation of Cyrus, which allows the exiles to return home, the completion of the Second Temple, and so the beginning of the Second Temple period. That is when Jerusalem and Judea restored become a province of Persia. They're not independent by any means. And so Ezra is a Jewish Persian official who reads the Torah the first time, perhaps in the year 444 BCE. So then after the Persian Empire is overthrown by Alexander, we have the Hellenistic period, where there is a very significant diaspora population of Judeans in Egypt, in Alexandria, where many of the texts of the Hebrew Bible are translated into Greek, ultimately all of them. And then, though in the initial phases, Judea is under the control of the Ptolemies, of the Egyptian Hellenistic Empire, but as of around 198 BCE, the Seleucids, the Greek or Macedonian kings of Syria, the Hellenistic kings of Syria then bring Judea into their sphere of influence. And when that happens, everything goes south as they are have a much worse relationship with the Judeans in Jerusalem than the Ptolemies had done. And so we have the sacking of Jerusalem in 167, the Maccabean revolt, and ultimately the brief period of independence under the Hasmoneans, under the Maccabees, before the Romans then conquer the whole east, the Seleucids and the Hasmoneans, and replace the Hasmoneans with the Herodians. And so that brings us to Roman Judea and the earliest texts of the New Testament in the beginning of the first century of the Common Era, the Christian era. And so you can see here then the whole kind of framework. One thing I'll just say is, again, this time frame from the setting to when the Maccabee period happens is actually a whole long time. So there's a long time for historians to, not historians, for writers, for biblical writers to be introducing a lot of anachronisms because they're unaware of what things were like back in the time of the Babylonian captivity. So when we are looking at the book of Daniel, an interesting thing to note is that we actually have two different surviving versions of Daniel. The one version is in Hebrew Aramaic, so it's not in any one language. It's not just in Hebrew or in Aramaic. It's in a combination of both. So that one starts in Hebrew, switches to Aramaic, and then concludes in Hebrew again. And then in the Greek version, the Septuagint version of the Bible, the Septuagint, we have the longer version, which includes all the stories that occur in the Hebrew Aramaic version, but then has additional stories that are not included. So, although the entire text of the Septuagint version of the book of Daniel is in Greek, we can identify the added material because, like I say, the Aramaic and Hebrew text survives separately. So you can kind of see as I'm drawing this scroll, the Septuagint would, if we only had the Septuagint, it would hide its underlying components. And if we only had that Greek, the fact that there are different segments here, that would remain kind of like a hypothetical literary construction like Q. But because we have both versions, we can tell, no, these Greek components are separate texts. In fact, we have, like I say, a Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek sections of the text. And so if we were to roll the whole scroll out and look at which components are what, the very introduction or first chapter of Daniel as we have it is an introduction written in Hebrew. Then we go to Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue, the five kingdoms. Then we have the tale of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being cast into the fiery furnace. Those two are in Aramaic. Then we have a prayer of Azariah, which is written in Greek and doesn't exist in the shorter version. There is the tale of Nebuchadnezzar's prediction of Nebuchadnezzar going mad, which is in Aramaic. Then we have that feast that King Belshazzar had, where he reads the writing on the wall. Then we have Daniel getting cast into the lion's den. Another set of visions, this time with the beasts that come from the sea. And that ends the Aramaic part. There's a new set of visions in the Hebrew part. There's a vision of ram and a he-goat, a vision of the 70 weeks prophecy, and then the angel Gabriel's revelation, all of that in the Hebrew, before we then get to sort of these, Daniel as the true crime expert romance tales, Susanna and the elders, and the Idol Bel and the dragon, which concluded the text in Greek. So how did this come to be? How do we have these texts or multiple texts glommed together to create, let's say, the longer book of Daniel? So if you've watched these lectures with me, you know that there are just countless examples now of ancient redaction. So redaction is more the rule than the exception. ancient authors, because in order to create every new copy of a book, you had to actually copy the whole book by hand. It was as easy as not, as you were doing that, to include, let's say, notes that had been taken as glosses, and now the glosses in the next copy become additions to the text. It's also completely possible to take two books on similar subjects, and when you're copying out a new copy, to combine those together, and so on. And so one of the examples that we've talked about many times is the synoptic question, the synoptic problem. Why is it that the Gospels of Mark and Matthew and Luke have a direct literary relationship? How are they formed? And the most likely scenario that most scholars agree about is that the authors of Matthew and Luke, working independently, each had access to copies of Mark and some now lost source, scholars call Q, and they each independently combined those two sources while simultaneously correcting and adding their own text. And so those are very complex sets of redaction in both cases. Another more simple one that we can tell is the direct literary relationship that occurs between the book of Jude and the book of 2 Peter, where the author of 2 Peter, who again is pretending to be Peter but clearly isn't, has taken the earlier book as a source material, cut it all up, or actually just copied little parts of it in as he's writing his own longer letter using some of the same themes and text, but repurposing it as his own new letter. And that's just a handful of examples. We also have the whole example of the creation of the Torah itself, the Pentateuch, the different authors there. We have the book of Job, which is a collection of multiple editions, books like Proverbs and so on. So for the book of Daniel, there would be many hypothetical possibilities of how this would happen. So we could have started with a Hebrew original, to which there was a big Aramaic component added, to which, for example, the later Greek editions were made, or vice versa. It could have been an Aramaic original to which Hebrew and then the Greek. Or it's completely possible that we're starting with three different texts, maybe. So you had an Aramaic text, a Hebrew text, and Greek texts, and they are all sort of combined together by different redactors independently. So those would have been different ways to imagine the text came together in its present form. But there are clues within the text that show that, sort of maybe surprisingly, the Aramaic text is the original. And I say surprisingly because the oldest texts of the Bible are written in Hebrew, and so you might think that as Aramaic displaced the Hebrew as the spoken language, that it would actually be a later writer that's adding that. But what's happened is there's a Aramaic text that a later redactor has liked and has expanded, but has expanded by writing new parts in Hebrew and failing to translate the original Aramaic into Hebrew. The languages are very similar, and so for a whole long time, certainly the biblical scholars would have known both languages in the Second Temple period. And certainly, if you go to Hebrew school today here in Toronto, they also teach both Hebrew and Aramaic because of all of the writing of the rabbis being in Aramaic. So from that expanded text, the Hebrew and Aramaic expansion, then the Greek version is a further expansion. But when the Greek version was made, both the Hebrew and Aramaic parts were also translated into Greek, which makes it so that you wouldn't be able to tell necessarily which portions were what if we didn't have the Hebrew-Aramaic part as well. Okay, like I say, why Aramaic? Nearly all of the texts of the Hebrew Bible actually are written in Hebrew. And frankly, the fact that the oldest parts of Daniel are in Aramaic is one giveaway that the book of Daniel is one of the newer texts. In fact, it's the newest text that made it into the Old Testament. Set in a time period that it's pretending to be much older than it is, but it's written much later. Aramaic, like I say, is related to Hebrew. It's a northwestern Semitic language, and the reason why it displaced Hebrew and other spoken Semitic languages is that the Assyrian Empire, followed by the Babylonian and finally the Persian Empire, used Aramaic as the Semitic languages that was their state language. So they had other state languages. The Persians also had Persian as an official imperial language, but Aramaic was one of the languages of government. And so that trickled down. And so provinces of Persia, like Judea, became Aramaic speaking. So if we look at the original book of Daniel, the Aramaic book of Daniel, it's interesting that we find that there is a chiasmic structure, and that is where there's a mirror. It doesn't just go A, B, C, D in a linear fashion. It goes in this A, B, C, C, B, A, this thing where you start at the beginning and go back to the end. And so essentially the beginning of the text is this interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the four kingdoms that are then displaced by the last Messianic kingdom. And at the very end is that interpretation of Belshazzar's dream of the four beasts coming from the sea that have the same effect. They're taken down by the last Messianic one. Similarly, the fiery furnace episode, like I say, is paired with Daniel in the lion's den. So the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are cast into the fiery furnace. The lion's den episode is very similar. And so those are the B episodes there. And then finally in the middle, we have Nebuchadnezzar's madness foretold in a dream that is interpreted by Daniel. And then the scene that we already read of the writing on the wall that Belshazzar has during the feast. And so that's how the solid, you can see why this book all by itself is a standalone, since it has an obvious structure that is deliberate, chiasmatic structure. So what are some of the themes? So we mentioned, for example, the story of the fiery furnace and the lion's den. So before Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians, Judean ethnicity was essentially coterminous with a physical location. So Judah had been an autonomous client kingdom, part of the Assyrian Empire's overall commercial zone and imperial zone. It was a client kingdom that had to pay occasional tribute to the Assyrians, but was otherwise part of their economic sphere. But they were an independent kingdom, and when they were there, that was what a Judean was. But when that kingdom was destroyed, and the exiles, on the one hand, were taken to Babylon, and many of the other exiles escaped to Egypt, that created Diaspora Judaism, or now think of as Diaspora Judaism. And indeed, this is actually the very beginnings of a Judaism that is distinct from the other religions of the time around it. Because now suddenly this is an identity that is housed outside of like the capital district of an Iron Age hill kingdom. It's now something that is an identity that's being maintained. And so one of the ways that identity is maintained is by creating diaspora literature. And so there are books like Esther, and the book of Daniel is another example. So Esther is set in the court of the king of the Persians, where Queen Esther is a Judean woman who is not only part of the court with her uncle, who is a high official of the Persian Emperor. Esther, because of her beauty, actually becomes one of the wives of the Persian emperor, the Persian king, when it becomes the queen of Persia. And even actually, the story of Joseph in Egypt from the book of Genesis is also really a diaspora story. We don't know exactly when it was written, but in any event, it was certainly popular with the exiles because, again, Joseph is acting as a courtier of Pharaoh, and he's getting into all kinds of courtly problems while he's there. So he has to do things to maintain his identity as a Judean living in a foreign land. So in terms of the book of Daniel, one example of a courtly story and maintaining the identity is found in Daniel chapter 3. So Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, creates this huge gold idol, and he commands all of his officials, everybody at court, to worship the idol at set intervals when they blow a trumpet. And if they don't do it, you'll get thrown into a furnace of blazing fire that they keep going around the clock so that they can execute people. Refusing to worship idols, of course, is one of the main parts of Judean identity. And so these three exiles, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, do not obey the order, and one of the Chaldean courtiers, or a couple of the Chaldean courtiers, say, this is our way to get these guys, and so they denounce them to the king. And when that happens, Nebuchadnezzar summons the three to appear before him. He wants to get to the bottom of it. Are these accusations correct? Are they disobeying his law? And they have to admit, yeah, okay. O Nebuchadnezzar, they say, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. If our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up. So this is a lot of faith, right? So they are proposing a test of faith. So they're not going to worship idols. They're not going to serve the Babylonian gods. And so if God wants to save them, that's God's business. Go ahead and cast us into the furnace. So that makes Nebuchadnezzar pretty angry, and he takes them up on their challenge. They are put into the fiery furnace, but to everyone's surprise, they are not hurt. And as people are trying to kind of stare into the fire to see what's going on, they see that the three are unharmed and they are with a godlike being. This impresses the king, who lets all three of them out. He gives them big promotions, and he even makes a decree that's honoring their God. Their God was clearly able to save them for the fiery furnace, so this God has mojo, according to Nebuchadnezzar. So there's a second variant of this story in this chiasmic way the book works. So we had that at the beginning, and this is echoed again in chapter 6, the lion's den story. Daniel, at this point, has risen high in the court of Darius the Mede. So Nebuchadnezzar is gone. Now it's the court of Darius the Mede. And that, once again, makes other courtiers jealous. This is part and parcel of how courts work and also of courtly literature. So the courtiers convince Darius to make a decree forbidding anyone from worshiping any god other than Darius for a period of 30 days on being thrown to the lions. Again, this is going to be just a fantastic story. This is not the kind of thing that actually would have happened, but you can see why it's flattering to the king to have this kind of a temporary prohibition on worshiping other gods, and also comparing the king himself to a god in the course of this. And in any event, that's how the story goes. So we read in chapter 6, although Daniel knew that the king had signed the decree, Daniel continued to go to his house, which had windows in its upper room open toward Jerusalem, to get down on his knees 3 times a day to pray to his God and to praise him, just as he had done previously. So So again, this is an identity marking story. So what do Judeans do to show that they are still Judeans, even if they're living in exile? They pray to their God and not to any idols, facing Jerusalem 3 times a day. Then those men watched and found Daniel praying and seeking mercy before his God. Then they approached the king and said concerning the interdict, "O king, did you not sign an interdict that anyone who prays to any god or human within 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into the den of lions?" And of course, he had made such a decree, such an interdict, and so the king has no choice but to enforce his own law, even though Daniel is one of his favorites. And so he has Daniel thrown into the lion's den, and once again, an angel intervenes, shuts the lions' mouths. And so then, remarkably, when Daniel emerges from the lion's den completely unharmed, Darius the Mede throws all of his courtiers into the lion's den. The lions, of course, eat them up very quickly. And then Darius once again makes a decree honoring the God of Daniel as the living God, just as the Babylonian king had done in the earlier episode. So in addition to these diaspora stories, these courtly literature stories in the original Aramaic part, I want to jump ahead to the Greek editions. So the Septuagint translation was conducted in Ptolemaic Egypt in Alexandria. The city included a very large, probably the largest Judean diaspora community. And so these kind of stories about making, these identity maintenance, how can we continue to be Judeans in exile when we're not living in the land, in diaspora? So once again, these appealed to that community, and some of the stories from the Greek portion, these additional tales also fit into that same genre. If we just look at the Hellenistic world as it evolved, so by the time Alexander had fallen and his successors, or died, and his successors had divided the empire between them, 2 of the greatest successors were the Ptolemies in Egypt, where Greek became an official language alongside the local Egyptian language of Coptic, and then the Seleucid Kingdom, where Greek again was one of the official languages alongside the Old Persian lingua franca of Aramaic, as we talked about. So within these kingdoms then, there were large diaspora communities at the Ptolemaic court, the capital in Alexandria. There was a big Judean population. And there was also a big Judean population at the Seleucid court in Seleucia, which is right next to Babylon, and at Babylon still, which was still peopled, because not everybody of the Judean exiles went back to Judeans. And so, in fact, the number of exiles that were in Jerusalem would have been smaller than those 2 diaspora communities, initially at least. So, unlike the Hebrew redactor, who composed a deliberate expansion of the Aramaic text, so we'll get to that. These Greek additions to Daniel are individual poems and tales, just stories of Daniel as a popular figure, and they might have circulated independently. The Daniel stories had appeal, like I say, to diaspora Judeans, like the large community that existed in Greek-speaking Alexandria. The story of the Idol Bel, in that story, Daniel once again expresses this sort of Judean identity by refusing to worship idols. That's just one of the things that sets Judeans apart, especially in the earliest period. So this is set after the Persians have conquered Babylon, and Daniel has once again become an honored courtier of the new ruler, King Cyrus of Persia. So we read in this chapter of the Daniel and the Idol Bel and the dragon, "Now the Babylonians had an idol called Bel, and every day they provided for it 12 bushels of choice flour and 40 sheep and 6 measures of wine. the king, Cyrus, revered the idol and went every day to worship it. But Daniel worshipped his own God. So each morning when Bel's shrine was opened, all of that bread and the lambs and the wine, the meat and the wine, everything which had been provided on the previous night, everything at the table setting and everything, that is all gone. And so that proved to Cyrus's satisfaction the efficacy of worshiping this idol. The king, Cyrus, said to Daniel, "Why do you not worship Bel?" Daniel answered, "Because I do not reveal idols made with hands, but the living God who created heaven and earth and has dominion over all living creatures." The king said, "Do you not think that Bel is a living God? Do you not see how much he eats and drinks every day?" And Daniel laughed and said, "Do not be deceived, O king, for this thing is only clay on the inside and bronze outside, and it has never eaten or drunk anything." So Cyrus decides to let the question be put to the test. Let's make it a contest. If Daniel is wrong, he's going to execute him. But if Daniel can be proved right, then Cyrus will execute all of the 70 priests of Bel. So they set it all up like they do every night. The priests put all the food and the wine and everything in Bel's sanctuary according to the normal procedure. Then they lock the temple doors and they seal them with royal seals. As expected, the next morning when the doors are unsealed, all of the food and drink is gone. It looks like Daniel's going to get executed. However, Daniel had taken the precaution of spreading ashes all around the floor. And so as they're about to go in, Daniel restrained the king from going in. And Daniel laughs and he says, "Look at the floor and notice whose footprints are all through all of the ashes here on the floor." And the king says, "I see the footprints of men and women and children." Then the king was enraged and he arrested the priests and their wives and children. They showed him the secret doors through which they used to enter to consume what was on the table. Therefore the king put them to death and gave Bel over to Daniel, who destroyed it and its temple. So a wonderful kind of whodunit mystery, almost like a Scooby-Doo mystery where, the wicked priests would have gotten away with it too if it weren't for this meddling Daniel. But in that, it's also like Scooby-Doo in the sense that unlike the earlier supernatural tales in the Aramaic text, Daniel here uses his wits to prove that the idol is not a god at all. It's like unmasking old Mr. McCleary. He's not really a swamp monster or a ghost. It's just, the guy trying to scare off the kids for whatever reason. He's got a gold mine or something. In this case, it's because the priests are getting free meal every night, a wonderful meal. And so Daniel does a similar thing where there's a dragon that is being revered as in Babylon as a god who is able to overfeed and cause it to explode and stuff like that. So among the same kind of stories that are these diaspora courtly stories is the story I talked about before of Susanna and the elders. So Daniel also uses his wits to unmask the plot of the Judean elders that are these lascivious guys who have been spying on Susanna as she bathes and then blackmailing her to get their way with her. So the lecherous elders have, as part of their plot, they've realized they can subvert Judean law by swearing falsely. If they each swear a testimony that she is the harlot and they have been upright, then they can, use false swearing to get themselves off and to punish her, even though she's the victim in this. So, and they try to do that, but Daniel is able to uncover their lie by having them put in separate rooms, and then he questions them, about the details of their story, and they soon break down as their details don't match, and so then, of course, he has them killed and clears Susanna. So if we go back to the Aramaic original, we just were looking at these kind of stories that appeal to Judean exiles are people in the diaspora community, but there's a lot of other content. And the rest of the content is this apocalyptic, prophetic content that includes also, like I say, the kind of prophecy that is actually future prediction. So I want to look at those. So Nebuchadnezzar's vision of this statue, like I say, with a head of gold, a chest of silver, thighs of bronze, legs of iron, feet of iron and clay, that is toppled with a rock cut without hands. This is actually going to give us a clue about when the actual author is living, because of what these different things are said to mean. So when Daniel gives his interpretation of what this vision means, he says that the statue represents a succession of kingdoms. So it's representing essentially human empires which are going through different ages of decay. Gold age, silver age, bronze age, iron age, and then finally a mixed age of iron and clay. And Daniel explicitly says that to Nebuchadnezzar, okay, the gold head here is your kingdom, Nebuchadnezzar. That is Babylon. So we know where the start of this is according to what the original author's intent is. So he represents the gold head. Daniel says, you, O king, are the head of gold. After you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over the whole earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron. Just as iron crushes everything and smashes everything, it shall crush and shatter all of these. And then as you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom. But some of the strength of iron shall be in it. And as you saw, the iron is mixed with the clay, so too they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And so that all by itself, if we kind of know, the history of the Second Temple period, and we know the succession of kingdoms, between the Babylonians, followed by the Persians, followed by Alexander and his successors, where the Macedonians are creating not a Greek empire, but a Hellenistic empire, that is, where the Macedonians and Greeks are deliberately marrying with the local conquered peoples, the Persians. Alexander took a Persian wife, and so on. That should already be a pretty clue to you what this is meaning to represent in the original intent. Finally, Daniel explains that the rock that is cut without hands, which topples the statue, that's a final Messianic kingdom, and that will be the means through which God will end the succession of human empires and create the mountain that is God's kingdom on earth. Like I said, in the chiasmic structure of the Aramaic text, this vision at the beginning of the statue with the kingdoms is paired with a second vision in chapter 7. In chapter 7, the last king of Babylon, Belshazzar, has a vision of 4 beasts. The 4 beasts again represent the same kingdoms as that succession in Nebuchadnezzar's statue. So the beasts are a lion with eagle's wings, a bear raised up with 3 curved teeth, a 4-headed leopard with wings, a beast with iron teeth and 10 horns, which then sprouts one last little rotten horn. And so both of these visions, like I say, represent the same 4 kingdoms. This is the same future dispensational succession being predicted. Again, beginning with the number 1 being known for sure, the gold head or the winged lion, that's the Babylonian Empire. These other 3 are all in the future from the perspective of the character of Daniel. So Daniel's living at the time of the gold head / winged lion. But the author of this text, the Aramaic Daniel, it's not in his future. This is a succession that he's aware of. And so nevertheless, he knows what he's talking about. And then nevertheless, apocalypticists, people who are reading Daniel, have their own readings of it. So if you're going to look on the internet even, and you'll see this, the most common identification that people make is, again, that Babylonian Empire is the first one. The silver kingdom is the Medes, the empire of the Medes and the Persians. The bronze is Alexander the Great and the Hellenistic empires. And then finally, the iron and iron clay, the beast with the 10 horns plus another horn, that gets identified with the Roman Empire. You'll see this on the internet all over the place. That's wrong. This is not the correct identification of any of those three. Although the final beast with the 10 horns and iron legs, and the additional horn, and the iron and clay feet of the statue, that's ever since Roman times, ever since the Roman conquest of Judea, apocalypticists have been identifying that with Rome. But actually, the text of Daniel is written before the Roman conquest, and we even have manuscripts of parts of it that predate the conquest. So the original author had actually a very different interpretation in mind, which is, of course, based on his own historical context. So the beast with the 10 horns and the little horn that comes from it, the fourth beast, actually is very clear, the meaning of it, if you look at the original text. So the actual meaning, the original intent of the Aramaic author of Daniel's is he, like we already saw, was very excited about the idea that the Medes conquered the Babylonian Empire, even though that didn't happen. And so then the Medes are the silver. The bronze then is the Persian Empire, and the iron and clay, beast with the 10 horns, and finally that one last little horn, that's Alexander and the Hellenistic empires. As I was pointing out, they're intermarrying the way the Hellenistic empires intermarried, and that last little horn, as we'll see in the Hebrew edition interpretation, that gets identified with it was going to be the very last Hellenistic king. It's identified with Antiochus IV of Seleucia for sure in the Hebrew edition. So the Hebrew redactors editions make this much more explicit even than what was actually pretty clear in the Aramaic original. So we saw how that we've gone through pretty closely now what the Aramaic part is in what's now chapters 2 through 7. To this, the Hebrew redactor added an introduction at the beginning, and then his own visions. And his visions make all of the other visions, it's very much more explicit. So he has a vision of a ram and a he-goat, the 70 weeks prophecy, where he's actually giving a time frame and chronology, and then an angel's revelation at the end. So let's look at the context of these Hebrew editions. So the successors of Alexander continued to vie for power. And as we saw, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies had been fighting all over the place, but including at a certain point over Judea. So the Seleucid Empire had lost territory in the east to Greco-Bactrians in Afghanistan area, and then also to the Parthians across most of Persia. The Parthians are an Iranian people that were able to retake the Persian heartland. The Seleucids then changed their focus westward to Syria and took Judea, Palestine from the Ptolemaic Empire in the year 198 BCE. There was a struggle. This ended up in having a struggle between Judean factions. So the Jerusalem nobility, the capital of Judea is Jerusalem, and the nobility is split between people who were Hellenizers, people who were very interested in adopting Greek customs, who didn't see Greek syncretism and practices as being incompatible with Judean religion, and traditionalists who wanted, certainly they couldn't help but have some connection with Hellenism, but were antagonistic to it, wanted to have a more firm separation between what does it mean to be Judean, what does it mean to be Jewish, than the Hellenizers. So when Antiochus IV returned to his base in Syria with his army after losing a battle with the Ptolemaic Egyptians in the year 168 BC. The Seleucid king was actually drawn into the conflict that was this Judean civil war. So now as we're kind of looking again, let's reorienting ourselves in the timeline, you can see what I have right around 200, the 198 line, this period when Judea switches from Ptolemaic control to Seleucid control. And now after Antiochus III is the one who takes Jerusalem, now Antiochus IV actually sacks Jerusalem, which is going to set off the Maccabean revolt and so forth. So Antiochus IV sacks Jerusalem, refounds it as a Greek city. He rededicates the temple in Jerusalem to Zeus. He seems to have set up a statue or idol of Zeus there. And so Antiochus then outlaws traditional Jewish rites and practices. So it's becoming definitely an attempt, a very different attempt than had happened before. Before, the Hellenistic rulers were relatively tolerant. Now they're deciding we've lost too much here in Seleucia. Now everybody in Seleucia is going to have to Hellenize so that we can all be on one team and we don't keep losing territory. Doesn't work, of course. The desecration then of the temple in the year 167 BC, that's the immediate context for the Hebrew additions to the book of Daniel. So the author of the Hebrew portions must have really prized the Aramaic text and felt that the Aramaic text was predicting his own time. And so he wrote additions to explain that much more clearly and to show it more firmly. So the Hebrew text very accurately and explicitly predicts the actions of Antiochus IV all the way up through the year 167 BC, the desecration of the temple. So let's look at like all of the anachronisms. So it should already be clear that the authors of the Aramaic Daniel, the author of Aramaic Daniel stories, were confused about the past. So the text, like I said, describes the succession of power from the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar to his son Belshazzar, who was overthrown by Darius the Mede, and that's followed by Cyrus the Persian. In actual history, Belshazzar, region in the year 539, had been the son of Nabonidus, who is 4 kings away from Nebuchadnezzar the first, and so therefore is not his immediate son the way the book portrays it, not his son at all. Babylon is not conquered by Darius the Mede. There was no such person. The Medes were not the conquerors, as we saw. It was Cyrus the Persian who did. Darius the Persian began to rule in 522, 8 years after Cyrus' death. So the core of the Aramaic text is the author's prediction of this succession of kingdoms leading up down to his own day when Alexander's successors had divided up the Hellenistic world. So the pious pretense of pretending these kingdoms are in the author's actual past, when in fact they are future events that are predicted by Daniel, that enhances the author's predictive capacity. So he's able to say, look, the whole end is nigh because by setting the text so much further back, he's able to show this huge track record of all of these things that he said would happen. All of these kingdoms did fall, and now his prediction that the Hellenistic kingdoms are going to fall and be replaced by a Messianic kingdom must be accurate considering his track record. So in the Aramaic original, this is the prediction of the coming Messianic kingdom. So in the days of those kings, the Hellenistic rulers, at the end of that succession of 4 kingdoms, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall this kingdom be left to another people. It shall crush all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. And just as you saw that a stone was cut from the mountain by not hands, got from a mountain not by hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, The great God has informed the king what shall be hereafter. The dream is certain and its interpretation trustworthy. So we know that there's going to be the succession of kingdoms, and then God is going to destroy all human kingdoms and create a Messianic kingdom immediately at the end of this. So this is the time frame. So, although contrary to his prediction, God's Messianic kingdom didn't destroy all other kingdoms on earth and was not established in the lifetime of the original authors. The additional author, the Hebrew redactor, believed, like I say, that those predicted events were occurring right before his own eyes in the year 167 BCE. So the desecration of the Second Temple had to be a big sign if there ever was going to be a sign. And so he adds, all of these parts to make those additions more explicit. One of those visions that he adds is a vision of a ram and a goat. And this is Persia and Greece. So the Hebrew author adds a vision that Belshazzar has of a ram with 2 horns, defeated by a goat with a great horn that is replaced by 4 lesser horns, and then finally a little wicked horn. So a ram with 2 horns. So the Medes and the Persians, in the one case, and then replaced by a goat with 4 lesser horns. This last little horn, the little wicked horn, it says, will desecrate the temple and cause sacrifice to cease at the temple for 2,000 evenings and mornings. So that sounds pretty explicit. We're getting who's going to be the little horn that's going to cause the temple to be desecrated, and then it will cause sacrifice to cease. We know it's going to be Antiochus. But if that weren't explicit enough, the angel Gabriel explains, the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. So I always thought it seemed pretty clear, but if you didn't think it was clear enough, the angel Gabriel actually tells you it. And then he says, the male goat is the king of Greece. The male goat is Alexander the Great. And as for the horn that was broken, in the place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation. So after Alexander the Great's fall, we will have 4 horns that will take its place. The Seleucids, the Ptolemaics, the kingdom of Lysimachus, and the kingdom of Cassander, the original heirs of Alexander. So again, the vision is very explicit. The little horn from the male goat, the Hellenistic kingdoms, that desecrates the temple then is clearly Antiochus IV, who desecrated the temple in 167 BC. So these are all tracking very clearly and explicitly. However, this is the moment when all of these historical predictions, as it were, where it's actually talking about events that are in the past, they begin to go awry. And then why are they going to now go awry? Because the predictions that the author of the Hebrew editions is making, he's not talking about something that exists in his future, not just Daniel's future, but his future. And so in his vision of the 70 weeks of years, so a week is a period of 7 days, so a week of years is a period of 7 years. So there's 70 periods of 7 years in this vision that are covered in this vision. The angel Gabriel announces a very explicit timeline for the end times in Daniel. Gabriel says 70 weeks, that is to say 490 years, are decreed for you and your people in your holy city, Jerusalem, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. So you got this long for the second temple period to last so that you can do all those things. Know, therefore, and understand from the time that the word went out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the time of an anointed prince, there shall be 7 weeks, that is to say 49 years. And then for 62 weeks, 434 years, Jerusalem shall be built again with streets and moat, but a troubled time. So, in other words, there will be a guy after Cyrus. There'll be, a certain number of years before the temple will be rebuilt. Then it will last for several centuries. But then we're going to get to this time period when we're at. After the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. So now we've gotten to a date that corresponds with 171 BCE. And so what we know from other historical sources is this anointed prince. This corresponds with the leading official in Jerusalem, the high priest Onias III, who as a high priest is anointed. So he's the prince of the city, he's anointed. He is assassinated on the order of the Seleucid governor as this whole thing was unraveling. The verse continues, the troops of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. So, of course, this refers to the Seleucid king, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who sacks Jerusalem and destroys the sanctuary in 167. The verse continues, it shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. So now that means war will not cease until the very end of the world. Desolations are decreed. Antiochus IV, shall make a covenant with many for 1 week. That is, for a period of 7 years, there's going to be some kind of an alliance that Antiochus is making. And then for half the week, just 3.5 years, he shall make it so that sacrifice and offering cease. And in their place, there shall be a desolating sacrilege until the decreed end is poured out upon the desolator. So for a period of time, because there's a desolating sacrilege, there's an idol, maybe an idol of Zeus, set up in the temple by Antiochus IV in Jerusalem in 167. It's really only going to be for 3.5 years, and then that will end. The end is poured out upon the desolator. So up to this point, like I say, the Hebrew redactor's math lines up pretty well with history, his own recent past. But like I say, it's at this point with his predictions that take place after the year 163 that things go off the rails. And that begins with this predicted death that he has for Antiochus IV. So we read that having conquered his foes, the king of the north, he'd been fighting the king of the south. So the king of the north is the Seleucids, the king of the south is the Ptolemies. The king of the north, Antiochus, will lead his army to respond to rivals again, trying to have an uprising. But we read in Daniel 11:45, he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the beautiful holy mountain. That is to say, between the Mediterranean Sea and Jerusalem. Yet he shall come to his end with no one to help him. So he's supposed to die there with his army in the plains, in Judea, between Jerusalem and the sea. But in actual history, Antiochus led his army on a campaign against the Parthians in 164. He retook the kingdom of Armenia and he attacked some of the former Seleucid heartlands of Persepolis, the king of the capital of Persia, which the Parthians had conquered. He doesn't take it back. And then, having gone on campaign against the Parthians, on his way back in the city of Isfahan in Iran, he dies. So he does not die in Judea between Jerusalem and the Mediterranean. So, like I say, having predicted the sack of Jerusalem in 167 by Antiochus, but failing to predict the location of his death in 164, this has led to a scholarly consensus that the Hebrew redactor's additions to Daniel were written between those years, since he knows the one thing and then he doesn't know the other. The redactor knew that the temple desolation had come half a week after Onias III's assassination, and thus, if we do the math, he is only anticipating that another half a week would remain before the whole end of the world happens, where God's kingdom would be established literally on earth, and that is to say the end should happen by around 164 BCE. But of course, it didn't happen. But we can now date and put on our timeline here around 165, let's say, the Hebrew additions to Daniel as this apocalyptic prophet who believes he's living in the end times, is writing his predictions that the end of the world will happen in a year or two. Of course, like I say, the world didn't end. In fact, the temple was restored 3 years after its desecration. And that restoration was not accompanied by all of the just being resurrected and Daniel returning to earth and the history of the world ending. So instead of a literal apocalypse, the temple was rededicated in 164 BCE, and Jerusalem eventually became the capital of the autonomous and later independent Hasmonean Kingdom, the Maccabees. That rededication, of course, is celebrated by the Jewish festival of Hanukkah, which happened instead of the apocalypse. So one of the themes that we've had in this lecture is what happens when apocalyptic prophecies fail. So I suggested that that at the very beginning of this, that maybe one of the reasons why the author of the book of Daniel miswrote history and suggested that the Medes had conquered the Babylonians and not the Persians, so that he could insert the Medes in between the Babylonian and Persians, is perhaps because he felt that Bible verses in Jeremiah and Isaiah had predicted that the Medes were the ones who were going to destroy Babylon, and preferred to have that happen because his commitment was stronger to prophecy than it was to history. And really, that is what happens a lot. So apocalypticists are actually quite committed to their view of the world and their commitment to their belief that the world is going to end. And while some of them do end up, when it doesn't come true, when some very explicit calculation or prophecy fails to happen, the end is Thursday, as the sky sign says. When that doesn't happen, when that result that fails to manifest, there are some who say, oh, okay, I don't believe in this anymore. I'm not going to be apocalypticist anymore. I realize this way of thinking is wrong. But the more common result actually among the faithful is reinterpretation, which then leads to recalculation, and they set a new date for the world's end. So an example of what happens when prophecies fail, there is a group in the 1830s and 40s called the Millerites, who had a very strong belief that the world was going to end in 1844. But although they were very committed to that, and they sold property, and they started, sit around and wait for it to happen on the actual date in October 22nd, 1844, the end of the world, of course, did not happen. Nevertheless, the prophecy's failure did not end the Millerite movement. One of my favorite YouTube channels is Useful Charts, and he had a series this summer where he charted out all kinds of Christian denominations, and you can see here under his episode 6 of Mormons, Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others. Under the Adventist column, this begins with the Millerites, who have their great disappointment in 1844 when the end of the world doesn't happen. But that's not the end of the Millerite tree by any means, because the Millerite movement continued to move on, and Jehovah's Witnesses come from that, as well as the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and also the Worldwide Church of God, which is the church that the guy who creates the Useful Charts denomination, the Useful Charts website, that was the denomination that he was raised in. So in other words, people recalculate and they continue on even after very explicit apocalyptic prophecies fail. Part of that is, I think, because of the sunk cost fallacy. So it's illustrated here with this little dog who thinks he's left his bone, and he starts digging. Once he's started digging there, he's really committed to it, right? And so eventually he's dug in way too far, and the bone is, of course, as we see someplace else. So there's an aphorism here: in for a dime, in for a dollar. People a lot of times, once they are already made a bad investment, they prefer to hold on to their bad investments, wanting to recover it because they've already invested so much, when in fact it would be better to shift your losses and cut your losses and invest in the investments that are doing well. So the better aphorism is, don't throw good money after bad. So once once something is already a failure, you don't have to keep on doubling down and investing in it. You should move on. Spectacular failure of apocalyptic prophecy is just as likely actually to result in increased loyalty of followers who have sunk costs rather than their disillusionment. So all these bulletin boards that announce days, the people aren't done with that. They just update them with their calculation later. This is a guaranteed date according to the Bible, according to the bulletin board. In that sense, I think apocalyptic doctrines function a little bit like conspiracy theory thinking, where a besieged group believes that they share special knowledge that elite experts lack. And this can lead to horrible fiascos in cults like, in this particular case of Jonestown. So, although pre-literate societies sometimes envision themselves as an ongoing cycle of eternal round, some of them, picturing history as a line and seeing yourself nearer at the end of it is a natural consequence of starting to write history. As you write down what went before, you remember a more and more remote past from where you are, from which you are far removed. And of course, if you're looking back at that timeline, we're at the end of that timeline. We can't see the future. And so therefore we see ourselves at the end of the time naturally. And so apocalypticism is just part of a natural function of something I would call temporal narcissism. If you're a Time Lord with a TARDIS that you could take to any point in time, does it make sense that you always go to late 20th century and early 20th century Britain, 21st century Britain, or that you go there so much times, or visit Queen Victoria all the time? Where else would you go? Well, literally any time and in an entire universe you could go, but it always ends up you're going there. And the same thing happens in Star Trek, where they end up more often than not visiting the year that the movie or the TV episode is set in. So Star Trek IV here, they went back to 1980s San Francisco. There was a recent episode of Star Trek, the Star Trek series that's filmed here in Toronto, and they came to Toronto in our year that we are now, or around our year. So that happens all the time. So apocalypticism has a little bit of this same kind of temporal narcissism, where you start to think that all of these texts refer to your time. So apocalyptic authors, in fact, believed themselves to be living at the end of their time. So each one of these apocalyptic authors is not writing about some time in the far future where they're envisioning, oh wow, 3,000 years from now, that's when the end of the world is going to happen. They think it's going to happen within the next 2 or 3 years. That's what their calculation is. But the readers, in misunderstanding the text, share that same lack of perspective, falsely imagining the text to refer to their own time, the reader's time, when in fact the texts actually refer to the author's time. It's not about you or your time, it's about them and their time. So, although the calculations of the original authors of Daniel fail, their visions, which are pretty amazing, the writing on the wall, the statue, and so on, their visions continued to inspire. And so, for example, when the Romans destroyed the temple, again, for the last time in the year 70 of the Common Era, the author of the Gospel Mark, who loved the book of Daniel and referenced it all the time, updated Daniel's predictions and brought them into Christianity. And John the Revelator also updated Daniel's visions and the beasts, which now do represent the Romans, and so forth. Nevertheless, the failure of John the Revelator's calculus, the failure of the author of the Gospel of Mark's calculus. The world did not end in the first century like both of those two early Christians believed. That did not deter successors. So all through the Middle Ages, beginning especially with the medieval monk Joachim of Fiora, who made a very famous calculation that the end of the world was going to happen near his time. That calculation keeps on getting updated and is being updated to the present. And so, for example, an early modern thinker as famous as Isaac Newton spent at least as much, probably more time, studying the Bible and especially the book of Revelation in order to come up with what he considered to be a science of future prediction that would be similar to his science of calculus in terms of its efficacy. Newton's commentary on Revelation, he uses it to argue that the book of Revelation actually predicted the historical events of the conversion of Constantine and the fall of Constantinople. It does neither of those things, but again, Newton was very interested in trying to divine his own future. And I'll just mention in terms of our own experience in our denomination, in the same way that the Millerites were looking forward to the end of the world in 1844, the Latter-day Saint movement, as founded by Joseph Smith Jr., also was really founded on a belief that the second coming of Christ and the millennial rule of Christ were literal and that they were imminent. They were going to happen very soon. Members in the early church in the 1830s believed that the place where Jesus would come back again and would rule the world from a New Jerusalem, that center place, that New Jerusalem, that city of Zion, would be built in Jackson County, Missouri. And they actually started to lay out plans for that city of Zion in what's now Independence, Missouri, or what was then Independence, Missouri as well. Early members like Martin Harris, who is one of the Book of Mormon's witnesses and was also the financier of the Book of Mormon, he was so confident that the end of the world was going to happen within the next 2 or 3 years. He actually wagered to somebody in a bar that he would see his hand cut off. They could cut his hand off if it didn't happen, which he reneges on that bet. He wasn't hanging around in the bar long enough probably for anybody to take him up on it. But in any event, it didn't happen. As members attempted to build the New Jerusalem, they offended local settlers and were ultimately driven out of Jackson County, their place for the New Jerusalem, at gunpoint. The denomination that Center Place is part of, which we call Community of Christ, it shares its same origins in the Latter-day Saint movement with the Utah Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, what most people think of as the Mormon Church. And so although we in Community of Christ no longer envision a literal apocalypse, we nevertheless, our headquarters temple is actually built on that traditional site of the New Jerusalem in Independence, Missouri. And as people thought of new ways to think of the millennium, as of the 1970s in Independence, some members of Community of Christ built a kind of a futuristic, progressive utopia where they are living in kind of domed houses and trying to have different kinds of communitarian living as their way of having some kind of a precursor of a lived millennial experiment. So it's not entirely gone within the movement, it's just changed substantially. And in the Utah tradition, beliefs continue to be a lot more literal. And in fact, because many members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints believe that a construction of a Mormon temple on that temple lot in Independence, Missouri would be a sign of the end times, people speculate that the Mormon Church built its temple in Kansas City pretty much as far away from possible from the traditional site. So it's across the river from Independence in Clay County as opposed to in Independence, Missouri and Kansas City. So nevertheless, a lot of Latter-day Saints continue to be literalists and millennialists and very focused on it. And so there's a group of preppers, and it's not limited to Mormons. There's all kinds of millennialists who are preppers, who are preparing for the apocalypse. And as preppers have become overzealous, leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have sometimes tried to tank down on the idea, don't store too much food and that sort of thing. So like I say, there have been a lot of evolving attitudes about the end, both religious and secular. But nevertheless, these visions continue to inform the apocalyptic imagination today. So it didn't take me anything to be able to Google a modern painting or image anyway of the four beasts of Daniel, and lots of people's interpretations about how it refers to our time. But rather than continually spending our time focusing on the math and trying to update it so that it relates to our time, I think for myself anyway, time and effort are maybe better off trying to build an envisioned peaceable future ourselves. And so in the case of Toronto Center Place anyway, we like to do that through initiatives like continually learning and growing through the Center Place channel, abolishing poverty by through our CNIDO social housing affiliates, pursuing peace like we've tried to do through for example, our participation in Churches for Middle East Peace. First off, I want to thank so many people who've been making donations and giving their support. Thanks to JM, to Dartha Rama, to Mark Long, to Dave Anderson, to Daryl Scott, to JH. DC asks, what are your thoughts on the current partition of Syria between Israel, Turkey, and Al-Qaeda, but I guess it's not the former Al-Qaeda affiliate that is taking place at present? Well, so I'm no fan of the al-Assad regime. This is one of the most corrupt governments that have been on the planet. But obviously there's a lot of chaos that is going on the ground, so it's not clear what's going to emerge. I'm not going to do a prophetic prediction on that because I think it's not clear what's going to happen. But as you point out, there's actually, in addition to the various local rebels in Syria who have now taken over control of the government, there are large swathes of the country that are occupied by, foreign military powers. So Turkey, Israel, United States. The Russians and Iranians have had presence. I think they've evacuated. So there's still a lot to sort out if the Syrians are going to be able to rebuild. So we'll hope that they are able to assemble something that's better than what has been the case in the last decade of civil war and the last half century of the Assad regimes. Forden Gamzee says, I read an Ugaritic myth about a king Danel, and it had me wondering if there was any link with this Daniel. It's interesting. I don't know, and so I'm not aware of that. It's an interesting thing to look up. It sounds like it's a related word in the Ugaritic, related to Ugaritic language, right? So it'd be interesting to find out if there is some kind of a mythic figure or a figure of the same name that maybe is the traditional or legendary character or name that Ezekiel is drawing on. So the character, I think, didn't exist until, I don't know that there's any pre-existing stories about Daniel as the a courtier until we have maybe the Ezekiel name inspired that one to be the original ones to be written, as far as I could tell. So, but it could be that there's another figure with the same name. Wandering Servant says, do we see a link in the historical documents between the presence of Daniel and the three others in the Babylonian culture, or any other Israelites to the wise men from the east and their influence on others to pursue Yahweh. So yeah, the three others, I guess you're saying Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, so Daniel and his three friends. And is there any connection between those characters in the book of Daniel and then the wise men from the east that are referenced in the Gospel of Matthew's nativity or Christmas story? So the first thing to note is that even though traditionally we say that there are three wise men, or we three kings of Orient are, in fact, the Gospel of Matthew does not say that there were three in number. It just says there are wise men that came from the east. We assign the number three to them traditionally because they bring gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So there's three gifts, according to the Gospel of Matthew, but we don't know how many wise men. So it's not a deliberate reference, I don't think, to equating them to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Just by total coincidence, or not coincidence, but anyway, coincidence between this idea from the authors, the book of Daniel assigns the name Balthazar to Daniel as another name of his, as an alternate name of his, and Balthazar is one of the traditional names that is given to one of the three kings, and so there are kind of Eastern or Oriental sounding names, and they're getting reused in the different traditions. I don't think that that's equating them. The Daniel and his companions, they're in the East, they're in Babylon, but they are Israelites. They're Judean exiles. The wise men in the Gospel of Matthew, even though Christian tradition later assigns them all kinds of different places they might be from, they're clearly they're magi, so they are priests of the Zoroastrian religion. So they're coming from the state religion of the Persian Empire. So they're not meant to be the same thing or echo each other. Fastball flakes. Who was the artist who did the Daniel and the Lion's Den painting about an hour into the lecture? It reminds me of someone I know, but the name escapes me. One of the ones I showed was the Rembrandt, and I don't know the names of the other two paintings. I think I showed three different paintings depending on which of the Daniel. I showed a lot of Daniel paintings, so I'm sorry to say I don't know Fastball flakes. Oh, Daniel and the Lion's Den. Yeah, that one's there. One of them is a famous one, and I don't remember where you sort of you're seeing the face of Daniel, and he almost looks a little agonized, but I guess he's praying. But in any event, I don't know who painted that, actually. I'd have to look it up. Is Bel cognate with Baal? Crimson 90 asks. And I'm trying to remember that one. I think it may not be, but I have to look it up because the answer to that is either yes or no, and I don't remember. I've looked it up before, but so maybe it is. It's the Babylonian version of Baal, the Canaanite god, but I'd have to look it up. Ricky Palacios says, how do we know that Alexander the Great is the one the author of the book of Daniel is talking about? Because all of the things that are said about it, so they call him the king of Greece. He conquers the whole world. His kingdom is then divided into four pieces. All by itself, that's enough. In other words, these are lots of references. So it doesn't say Alexander. He doesn't in as many words as saying Alexander, but it does call the beast the king of Greece. So that's. It's Alexander the Great, the conqueror, who is the king of Greece that conquers the Persian Empire, is Alexander. Stephanie Ceresi says, any chance that we can get copies of the slideshow, especially the main timeline from this lecture? Yes, absolutely, Stephanie. Just email me and I'll send you the whole slideshow, or I'll certainly send you the timeline, whichever one you want. K. Tempest Bradford says, how did people get tricked into thinking that Daniel was written by Daniel when the last prophecy was wrong. So after the last prophecy went wrong, then people are no longer associating. They no longer associate the little horn with Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So in other words, even though the authors at the time are saying that and are making it very clear, people love the imagery, they love the prophecies, they're not aware of what the actual author's intent was, and so they try to recalculate it for themselves. And so, like I say, by the time 100 years or so, a couple hundred years have rolled around, and we're now in the year 70 of the Common Era, and the Romans are destroying the Second Temple. Now suddenly, that's seeming like that's what the prophecy is referring to, at least as far as the author of Mark is concerned. And so the author of Mark is so convinced that this is a sign that Daniel's prophecies are now coming true again, that's one of the things that inspires him to write the Gospel of Mark, our first narrative Christian gospel. And so at a certain point, even though these associations are really clear, they're really clear to us because we have the modern academic discipline of history. At a certain point, we can look all these things up. We're able to align these. We can look at all of the seams. We can look at each individual text. We're able to see it. When you're just reading, let's say this, like Newton was doing in King James English, it doesn't immediately seem as obvious as it is to me. He didn't have, a book about the history of Antiochus IV and the Seleucid kingdom's interactions with the province of Judea and the Maccabee revolt and those kind of things. He only had, let's say, the biblical texts on that. And so as a result of that, people who treasured the texts don't see them necessarily immediately as being wrong. Even the first people who were interpreting it the one way, which was the author's original intent, they stop interpreting it that way and they start interpreting it a new way right away. Like I said, that's why the Millerites didn't stop believing. They continued on, and that's why they became Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses and so on. Michelangelo says, why did kings and pharaohs have prophetic dreams according to the Bible? Was that a power that God gave them? Were dreams always seen as visions in antiquity? So literarily, dreams are often seen as visions, and it works in literature all the time. So I think doesn't Caesar's wife have a dream that he's going to get assassinated the next day and that kind of a thing, or has a dream that could be interpreted that way? So the dreams are seen as being rich with imagery, and the imagery has to be interpreted. That's just a literary convention that exists both biblically and also in Greco-Roman culture and other cultures. So I think you're raising an interesting interesting theological idea. So in the polytheist world of the Greco-Roman world, you might be given these visions from who knows what different deity, as there's lots of different powers like the Fates and other, Apollo, the Muses. There were all kinds of different sources for divine information. And so any number of those different sources may be speaking to different people and individuals in dreams. And they can also be giving revelation in a more straightforward way as well. But it's an interesting theological question as you develop a stricter monotheism. Is God directly giving those visions to, like having Nebuchadnezzar have a dream or having Pharaoh have a dream? Maybe so. I guess the answer is that God is actually the cause of those, And maybe the reason for it is to show the power of God's prophet, since the prophet then is given the capacity for interpretation. So that's probably, I guess, the theological reason according to these literary accounts. So what I would say is that this isn't something that happened really. This is a supernatural literary device. Is how this is happening. There may have been lots of people who had dreams and there were lots of practitioners who tried to interpret them, but their ability to do that would be as similar to all of the other courtiers who are and the sorcerers and other Chaldeans and so on who are trying to interpret the dreams. It's a similar way about divination that comes from all of the other forms of divination, from haruspexy to astrology. People are very interested in finding out what the future is going to hold. Trent Hogan, do you believe the book of Daniel has a place in the Protestant canon? What do you feel is the most important message conveyed in the book? It definitely has a place in the canon. So I am not one that feels that we should take books out because they're pseudepigraphical, or they're not written by the people who claim to have written them, and so on. Because I think that that kind of pruning is drawn from a incorrect idea of what all the rest of Scripture is. So I think in terms of the use of biblical texts religiously, the revelatory power comes for the practitioner, the Christian in the present day, who is reading the Scripture responsibly in concert with the Spirit and applying the messages faithfully in their life. There are all kinds of I'm not sure about, I have to think what the most important message is from the book of Daniel. There are a lot of different messages from the book of Daniel, but certainly the messages in the different courtly stories are things like it's important to maintain your values and your identity. That sometimes when you behave in a way that is true to your convictions, people around you may find that they respect you for doing that. I think that could be, some of the interpretation, or an interpretation from the lion's den and the fiery furnace parts. Another message could be, truth will out, and in terms of the Susanna and the elders, or the priests of Bel, who are practicing deceit, and so at a certain point their machinations are brought to light. So, in some ways the book is, I think, less philosophically or theologically sophisticated than other books, because a lot of it is either romance or a kind of apocalyptic prediction. But even the apocalyptic prediction parts, even if they have less message, they are still interesting for their imagery. And unfortunately, Judeo-Christian canon, scripture, mythology is much less rich in imagery than, say, Greek and Roman mythology was. And so there's less that you can picture. And so this is something that actually is very picturable. Josh Bedford, if you haven't already addressed it, what's the meaning of the fourth person in the fiery furnace? So presumably an angel is present, protecting them. I'd say it's not God that's walking among them, because later in the story that mirrors this, in the lion's den specifically, it's an angel that is the one that closes the mouths of the lion. So I'm just suggesting that it's probably the fourth person that they're seeing is that an angel's protecting them, but people are able to see that. Mary Magnuson says, why hasn't God inspired additional scripture over the past 2,000 years? Did God just quit figuring out that was all he wanted to say to us? So in Community of Christ, my church, we believe that God is speaking all the time, in that we can find new sources of revelation and inspiration. Truth can be found wherever you find it, and that God speaks to all peoples in all times. And so that in addition to the formal canon, you may find there are all kinds of incredible truths, for example, in the Tao Te Ching or something, or in traditions that are not part of our tradition. You can find truths in the dialogues of Plato. But we also, as a church, very rare among all Christian churches, we have a formal canonization process. So when we have we're called to be a prophetic people as a people, but also we have the leader of our church is called to the role of prophet to the church, prophet of the church, and they are one of their roles is to pray about, to discern, to consider what God wants to tell us as a church today, and to bring inspired counsel to the church. Then the church, meeting in its world conference, prayerfully considers and discerns whether that is revelation for the church, and then we can come together to decide whether we're going to add that to our canon, our book of Doctrine and Covenants. So I think that some of our most recent sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, some of our most recent scriptures in my church are actually some of the best scriptures. So I like them. But that's not a case for most denominations. So most Judaism and Christianity, almost the bulk of it, and Islam especially, yes, revelation ceased, or you're not ceased, but the canon ceased, and so the canon is not being added to in most cases. You can have new revelation but it's not added to Scripture. Michelangelo says, are there records of Judeans having important roles in the courts of the Babylonian and Persian kings, or are these characters in some ways aspirational? So I don't know that we have. I don't know that we have anything from the Babylonians where we necessarily have records that the Judeans are really important in the court. We know they're there. I think we might have some references to Judean officials in the Persian records, but the issue is in both cases are both of those courts. We don't have huge proportions of their archives, especially I think the Persians, and so unfortunately Alexander destroyed so much things in his successors. So I'm not sure that we have anything like the records to pour through to know. And so it's possible that, so I think that there are cases where there are Judean officials that do make their way into high office that we find in the later Greco-Roman world. And so it does seem like, this is a role that, let's say like local nobles that don't have a power base because their kingdom is somewhere far away and they're just a minority ethnic group. Why specialized courtiers like that can be useful to kings. So I think it is something that does happen, but I don't know that we can. It happens in general in history, but I don't know that we can find lots of examples of it outside of Jewish literature itself. So that's an interesting thing to look up, but I don't have like a great example of one that's not made up by the Judean-owned sources. So for example, the whole story of Esther, the book of Esther, that clearly is just a novel. It's a romance. That's not historical. There was not a Jewish queen who saved all the Jewish people from being massacred Persia-wide by Haman. That's just a Hellenistic or whatever romance novel kind of thing. Diaspora, Judean romance novel. Ghost in the Ghost in the Machine says, does John refer to the writings of the Apocrypha at times for extra wisdom? And it depends. I guess, I don't know, Ghost, if you mean, do I refer to them? Me, not you don't mean John the Revelator here, because we've been talking about that too. Sure, yes, I definitely, I look at all kinds of apocryphal books that don't make it into the canon, and I will use quotations from them in homilies and other things, and so I'm looking at them to get a bigger picture of both early Christianity or Judaism or essentially the development and other thoughts within those traditions, and so I would say the answer is yes. JH, important question. Has John watched the Battlestar Galactica reboot? Never any Battlestar Galactica references when I go down the sci-fi well. Yeah, that's funny. Why don't I reference Battlestar Galactica? I have. I like the Battlestar Galactica reboot a lot. I actually watched the original Battlestar Galactica when I was a kid, when I was out, and I really liked that as a kid. The reboot is very good, but like you say, I don't know why I haven't been referencing it. I mean, if we did more lectures on Mormonism, Battlestar Galactica has a very direct, relationship with Mormonism, since the original creator is a Mormon, and so lots of things like, Commander Adama is like the leader. The name is based on Adam, and he is the 12 colonies of Cobol are like the 12 tribes of Israel, and each of them have the name based on the zodiac signs, but they're like the Israelite tribes. And Cobol is related to the Mormon scripture, which is not part of Community of Christ scripture, the book of Abraham, which Joseph Smith said Abraham saw the star that was nearest to God, and it was called Kolob. And so that's why in Battlestar Galactica it's called Cobol. So there's a lot of pretty direct references to Mormonism in the original Battlestar Galactica, especially, but it carries on in the reboot, which is also really good. So maybe we'll think about adding some references. Dallaskin says, do you have plans for a future lecture on the book of Esther? Did we talk about Esther? We didn't already do one of that on Esther? If we haven't, we should. I mean, so yeah, I think that, I feel like I've talked about it a lot, but I haven't maybe talked about it in a deep dive. Same thing, Tobit. So both of those are part of, like Daniel, part of this literature of the diaspora Judea and the diaspora Jewish community. And I think that we need to, I think it's important to emphasize how much of Judaism, developmental Judaism, is in fact from the diaspora and has been lived in the diaspora throughout the history. And so as a result, books like Esther are important for understanding that development. So it'd be worthy of a lecture for sure. So Fastball Flake says, way off topic, but since I posted a romantic picture of Joseph Smith, do I think that some of the more recently discovered photographs of Joseph Smith are legitimate? So the most recently discovered photograph of Joseph Smith, as opposed to the one before that, which I would be at best on the fence about the earlier one, the most recently discovered one, the reason why I do think it has legitimacy is because of its provenance. And so the provenance is, you can find on the internet any kinds of old-timey photos that the Smithsonian has or anything like that, and you can say, well, this guy looks like Joseph Smith according to the the paintings that we have of him from his lifetime. But the question is, where was that? And so if it was just found in some random place and it's now in the archives in the Smithsonian or whatever, it's probably not Joseph Smith. But the case of the most recent photograph that has been identified with Joseph Smith, this was found in a locket that, or a pendant that was owned by the family of Joseph Smith, and we can actually trace the provenance of this particular locket through the women who were protective of Joseph Smith and maybe then also of this image. And so I think that it's got a pretty good case for it. I know that people look at it and they say, well, it doesn't really look like the painting, but I think one of the issues is that photos are different from paintings, and so it's straight on, so it's looking less like he's got his big nose, because again, if you look like this, you have more of a nose than if you what a photograph does. A painter emphasizes those things even though you're not seeing it in photorealism. Same thing, his eyes look different, but that's just because blue eyes, again, photograph in black and white differently than painted blue eyes. So that's one of my short answers to that. Final question for tonight. I'm pretty tired already. How long have we been doing this? A long time. Anyway, so Alan Young says, I believed the Bible as gospel until I read the scriptures as an adult. Same story with the Book of Mormon. It occurs to me now that the Lord has not spoken to the prophets in the first person, and the scriptures appear to be a compilation of tales that evolved over time. The question is, can I keep my faith as I lose my testimony? So Alan, I guess what you have to be detaching from here, is a faith that is grounded in literalism. So yes, if you are envisioning God as being just like a human being and speaking in human languages face to face with a human being, and that's what you're calling a prophet, that does not happen. So that happens a couple times in the Bible, and that happens literarily, as with Moses, but as with Moses, this is characters that are not historical. They're a legendary or mythic figure. And so the way that you maybe can keep your faith as you lose is to let hold of that kind of limited and literalistic envisioning of this, and instead look for what things you value, and start to identify God with more abstract, let's say, traits or virtues like goodness for goodness' own sake, love for love's own sake, and the other ways that frankly theologians have been proposing going all the way back. So the Bible and biblical writers are themselves aware of kind of the problems of literalism, and this is one of the reasons why, for example, as their conception of God evolved and became more expansive, more infinite, they were uncomfortable with picturing God because they knew that those pictures would be a false image and a false limitation. And so I guess what I would suggest is that if you maybe take it in that direction, where you do realize, okay, that maybe some of the childhood or imagery, but then also, let's say, taught by a more literalistic denomination, where the ideas of God and so on and scripture and so on were limited, or just it's black and white, that probably has to be let go of. But if you can see let's say, a deeper picture that is leading to your own, let's say, personal search for meaning, and also meaning within community, that could still be valuable to you, is what I would suggest. All right, everybody, we're gonna say goodbye. I'm going to be able to sit down. Appreciate it so much. Bye-bye.